Hello. My name is Juliette Tolay. I am Associate Professor of Political Science at the School of Public Affairs at Penn State Harrisburg. And I will be taking advantage of this video to present my latest article called The Inadvertent Reproduction of Eurocentrism in IR, the Politics of Critiquing Eurocentrism. And actually, more than a presentation, it will be more of a teaser to hopefully make you want to go and read the full article. I'm going to show you how it looks like. And so what really was at the core of this inquiry was this realization that both within academia and among policymakers, there is, Eurocentrism has been identified now for some time as being a problem and kind of a core issue that kind of perpetuates some inequalities in the world order. And despite that, we still have Eurocentrism being kind of reproduced. And there's been, some research done and some writing done on the reproduction of Eurocentrism, but what I was finding in my own research, which serve as the main cases for illustration regarding the politics of migration in Turkey, was that sometimes you had actors who really were somewhat, and I think genuinely trying to append and overcome Eurocentrism, but by doing so actually ended up reproducing Eurocentrism. So what I do in the article is I kind of try to reconceptualize this understanding of reproduction of Eurocentrism versus overcoming Eurocentrism, not as kind of two alternative methods, but rather as a continuum of different kinds of practices and different kinds of, scholarship that, may end up in reproduction, may end up in overcoming, but oftentimes will actually end up in this kind of odd in between that you can see mainly in yellow here that I kind of call inadvertent reproduction. So if you look at this specific graph, you can see that the intent of the actor might be one of intentional reproduction when you have a specific interest in the reproduction of Eurocentrism, or it can be out of indifference. If you have not been trained or do not know much what Eurocentrism is, you might just be reproducing it because this is how you've been socialized into. But then you have, and this is what I'm interested in, actors who are much more interested in criticizing Eurocentrism. But even within this, sometimes the type of criticism might lead, and then you go to the outcome section. So the intentional reproduction leads to uncritical reproduction. But within the critique, you have this ideal situation of moving towards a post-Eurocentric world that you see in the blue arrow. But oftentimes you actually fall into this inadvertent reproduction where you try to append it, but actually end up reproducing it. One of the findings of the paper is that even when you reproduce Eurocentrism inadvertently, it is not a 100% reproduction, and it can sometimes fall into this modified reproduction area where you both reproduce Eurocentrism, which is a problem, but you also partially modify it, which might be kind of a step in the right direction, or not, because as you reproduce, you end up kind of validating a certain system of seeing the world. So there is a discussion on the paper about this. This table here pretty much kind of summarizes most of the findings from the paper. So I'm going to take you through just a couple of the ideas here. But the first thing that I do in the first column is I identify different types of critique of Eurocentrism. The first one is kind of a rhetorical critique, which is mostly kind of a superficial critique, usually done by practitioners who say they want to overcome Eurocentrism, but in practice there are other interest and pragmatic decisions being made, and so they end up reproducing it as they go through. Another one is a practice that is more done by scholars of international relations, which I called kind of a deconstructive approach. And it's mostly about raising awareness and highlighting instances and consequences of Eurocentrism, but not necessarily providing solutions, which might be an issue. The third type is one that should sound somewhat familiar to people who have studied Eurocentrism or kind of postcolonial and decolonial theory, is a kind of decentering approach. And what I do is I distinguish within the decentering approach 3 different types of subtypes of decentering, which is the new center approach, the multiple center approach, and the no center approach. And what I highlight is, the no center and the multiple center are not always very practical, even though they are clearly kind of better alternatives. What ends up happening oftentimes is the decentering approach ends up creating a new center, which in itself might be reproducing some of the issues associated with Eurocentrism. And finally, we have a de-hierarchizing approach, which this time is not so much about challenging the assumption of who is at the center of our conception of world politics, but much more about challenging the norms and kind of hierarchy of norms that are being determined by Eurocentrism. And here as well, I kind of identify 3 main subtypes along kind of the same logic. One is a logic of inverted hierarchy, another one is one of new hierarchy, and another one is about no hierarchy. Here again, the no hierarchy approach or the new hierarchy approach are more ideal, but a little bit more difficult to do in practice. The inverted hierarchy one is again kind of one that you can identify empirically, that basically the structure of norms remain the same. It's just that instead of saying this norm is better than this other one, you value the second one over the first one as a way to kind of criticize the Eurocentric approach. For a number of these cases, not all of them, but I do have illustration that are mostly based on the case of Turkish migration policy. So I have one regarding the rhetorical critic that is based on this kind of continued externalization. Another one on the concept of critical Europeanization, which I argue Turkey is basically replacing a European center with the Turkish center in this approach. And then one on humanitarian discourse, which I argue is an example of inverted hierarchy. I don't have time here to go into details, but I hope you'll want to go into and read the articles to learn more about those. In lieu of conclusion, one of the things that you can really take out from the article is, the reproduction of Eurocentrism is quite ubiquitous. There is some value, although we don't know for sure regarding this modified reproduction that can be happening. There is also some value in differentiating between geopolitical Eurocentrism and epistemic Eurocentrism, and as a result, geopolitical modified reproduction of Eurocentrism and epistemic modified reproduction of Eurocentrism in terms of the kind of strategic values and standards of critical thinking that we have in academia. And finally, there is an interesting finding regarding kind of a paradox that we see in Turkish politics between 2 contradictory trends of Turkish elites that are both asserting a level of ontological sameness with Europe as a way to affirm itself as being on par with Europe and on European standards, and at the same time affirming ontological difference, where it declares itself as being completely different and actually being a better alternative. If you have any question, inquiry, suggestion, comments, feel free to get in touch with me. This is my email address here. You can also find me on any kind of social media, Twitter, academia, ResearchGate outlets to get in touch with me. Thank you very much.